Can we all just take a breath with that? And another one. The goodness of God is not just something that we get, but it's something that we experience. And sometimes we just need to take a moment to breathe that in. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm still Black, so I need a little bit from you. My name is Brandi Miller. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Chief Storyteller and Director of Spiritual Formation here at Quest. And I'm so honored to continue us in our series, Nothing Wasted, as we explore the land and its importance in our holistic well-being. So as we start, let's pray together. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing and just and integrous in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. I'm compelled that we have never been in this room with this group of people with this text before, and that means that God has something new for us. And I think that's an approach we can take to our spirituality and to our lives, and so I just want to invite you to be present as you are able in this moment, however you need to do that. Last time I was up here a few weeks ago, starting out this conversation about the land, I posited that our relationship to the land is core to us being truly human, and that our sense of wholeness is tied up in our ability to connect back to the earth and by extension to the creator of it all. I suggested that the Sabbath might be the very most important spiritual discipline for us to practice in order to experience healing in a more deep sense and to know the inherent goodness of our bodies and of the totality of creation. As we stepped back and looked at how God created on the 6 days, and then on the seventh day stopped to marvel, we watched God also step back, see all of creation together and good and connected, and call it the very good thing. And we are in our Sabbath experience of stopping, resting, releasing, enjoying, and worshiping to live as though connectedness and wholeness aren't just a future reality, but something that we get a taste of every single week. As I thought more about this concept of connectedness, particularly as it relates to the land, the word that keeps coming back to my mind is the word sacred. Sacredness is not simply a designation for things that are religious, but a way of referring to the inherent and high value of all things. It is a recognizing that all things are worthy of honor, of dignity, of respect, and of the opportunity to thrive. Sacredness is treating everything as though that is true. When we recognize things as sacred, we signal that they are of great value, that all lives and all life and beings are of higher value than they're esteemed in our day-to-day and in our world. In our world that is full of oppression and violence that would tell us that things are not sacred, that people are not sacred, that the earth is itself not sacred. When something is sacred, when we know that we ourselves, that you yourselves are sacred, we treat them and ourselves with care and dignity and deference and regard and meaning. We also create systems and work hard to interrupt patterns that get in the way of that, in us and outside of us. It's part of why I love the work of justice and compassion here at Quest. But to live as though all things are sacred is a distinct act of agency. It's a choice. We must choose to hold sacred what God has already called sacred. We also have to practice a more sacred view of life, one that finds the good and glory in all things and makes room to be impacted and shaped by the goodness of the entirety of the community of creation, even and maybe especially parts that we don't understand. To know the earth as sacred is to practice seeing all things as valuable, full of meaning, and worthy of our attentiveness. And I'd like to think that this is an easy lesson to learn, but it truly has not been for me. But I did learn it in a really practical way when I worked at the Hilltop Urban Garden in Tacoma, Washington. I was directing a summer justice program through my previous ministry job, and for summers, for 6 weeks, I would take 20 to 30 college students and work in the hood to become co-learners and laborers in spaces as was helpful. Hilltop Urban Garden was run by a trans, non-binary Black farmer who worked to create gardens out of unused spaces on people's property to provide free produce for the neighborhood. The organization that I was working for at the time was not affirming and was in many ways actively antagonistic to queerness and transness. So I held my relationship with the director with the one of, was the type of care you would hold like a fragile piece of glass maybe. And after a few years of essentially proving that we were not the worst, I asked if we could come for one day and work together with them. And they agreed. And honestly, I feel really proud of the ways that we were able to build relationships across differences and distinctions that could have been so separating, but it was this mutual sacredness, seeing of sacredness and trust. So my group arrived, and a third of us, myself included, were invited to harvest vegetables for the food distribution that week. And as they gave us each a pair of what I will say were aggressively sharp shears and a basket to place the harvest in, they said, "Before you take anything from any plant, I want you to ask the plant for its consent." And honestly, it felt to me to be a little woo-woo and maybe a little bit of an overkill of progressive values or something at that time. But we were guests, and when you're a guest, you go with it. Our group of 8 or so arrived at our site, and instead of the normal sort of loud and frenetic energy that often comes when college students get together to work, we all went quiet. And we moved toward the plants that we saw, and between quiet conversations with each other, we took moments to look at the plants, to touch them, and to listen. And now I won't say that I heard the plants say something back to me at each ask, but there were things that I felt. And so much of our Christianity has deprived us of the ability to trust what we feel and what we sense in order to privilege what we think. And I felt things. A hesitation that told me it wasn't time to harvest from some plants, and an ease that invited me to take from others. It was a practice of recognizing sacredness and confronting my impulse to take and to feel entitled to the earth and what it produced without having any sort of connection, let alone consideration of its needs and well-being. This director, who was far from Christian, at least in the religious sense that we would say, invited us to a very Christian practice of sacredness, of living and having the agency to choose to treat the land as good, to have a mutual, grateful, aware, slow, and compassionate relationship with the land that was providing for us and for our neighbors. I think that many of us don't actually even operate that way in our intimate relationships, let alone with the land itself. Beholding sacredness in that moment not only created a moment, but it interrupted something in me. My cycles of violence, taking, and sense of disconnection and superiority to the land. Because if we are honest, violence really only can occur, or is an impulse that is possible, when we lose the sense of sacredness of all things. So today we're going to explore a story in the text, and y'all, I'm proud of myself because I'm doing one story today and not the whole Bible, which is my custom, as you know. Sorry, I don't want to click this the whole time on you. Looks like I'm getting ready to fight. I promise you I'm not. I got a little stuck on this one. And we're going to look at one story in the text with a little bit of annotation on the side because I am still fully myself. It is the first story of brothers in the text, the story of Cain and Abel. And as I get into it, I want to draw us into some of the themes of Genesis in order to help us to understand not only the questions that the text is asking in order for us to consider and reshape our view of the story, but to understand the broader narrative and the creator in it, who is interacting with people in the midst of moral failure and human violence. Genesis 1-11 is full of really familiar and frankly Sunday schoolable stories that I think we miss the point of very often. It is the creation poems and narratives, it's the story of Cain and Abel, of Noah and the Ark, of the Tower of Babel, and more. It's a collection of stories that are asking the broader questions that Dr. Brian tackled in our Intro to Theology class, which will be available on YouTube on Tuesday. Those questions being, who is God, who are we, and what is the creation? It's a series of stories that aren't necessarily important because of whether or not they actually happened, but because they do happen. They do happen in our lives, and they both practically and thematically. So we read them to ask more universal questions and less specific questions about our being and how God interacts with our being. We read them to understand our connection with Creator and the creation. And in these 11 chapters of Genesis, humanity's relationship with the creation, the ground or land itself specifically, marks a measure of the quality and the fullness of human life. Adam is created from the dust in this intimate act, and the first human's job is to live as part of and a participant in the creation. They are to be stewards of the earth and all creatures on it. When the story of Noah's Ark happens, and God wipes out humanity, which we could talk about at a different time, again, not just because they happen, but because they happen, the concepts, the earth persists and survives, becoming the site of the new creation narrative that God is starting through Noah after human violence takes over in the first one. What that means is that as we read these first 11 chapters of Genesis, and really I think the whole Hebrew scriptures, we ought to be conscious whenever the land is mentioned, what it does, how it's engaged, and the agency it has, because it will almost always be a direct reflection of the human condition. It will reflect on people's consciousness and connectedness and disconnectedness from other humans, their own worth, and their relationship to the Creator. Lakota theologian Lenore Three Stars has said that you can tell a community's relationship with the land by how they treat the women among them. If women are extracted from, treated with disregard, denigrated, owned, controlled, or subject to the will of cis men, the land likely is too. In other words, our relationship with each other is reflected in our treatment of the land and our perception of its inherent sacredness. And Genesis has a lot to say about this reflection from Lenore Three Stars. So let's get into the text that comes from Genesis chapter 4. Adam made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The word of God for the people of God. We are introduced in this story to the first offspring of Adam and Eve. And it's important in these texts to remember a little bit of their story as we discover what the author of this text is doing as he ties these stories together. We find Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, this sacred paradise. They are told not to eat from a tree that will give them the knowledge of good and evil, because if they do, they'll die. They have been also given a mandate to be good stewards of the earth that they now find themselves in, which I would believe would mean that they would need some knowledge of good and evil. That seems necessary for the work. But I wonder if it's something more about God's timing in giving that knowledge and God's way of giving that timing that is present in the story. It's clear that this will be a necessary thing for them, but they seem to doubt God's generosity, enoughness, and timing, and they seize this knowledge for themselves. And we're told from the text that when they eat from the tree, that they will die. But instead, what happens is God introduces this grace and mercy and love by not giving the consequence that God's self seems to say is going to happen. We learn from the first Genesis story that this God is not set on consequence or punishment, but on generosity and love and mercy. It's the first fracture, though, of relationship with God, between them as people themselves, and from the land that they find so much of their meaning and vocation in. And I think this story is really tragic. And one of the tragedies of the text is that Eden itself represents this perfect connectedness of all things. And in the Genesis story, as they move farther and farther from the land, they also move farther and farther from the true and inherent sense of Edenic wholeness, of connectedness, of true self. And as an aside, I think that many of us would benefit from the work of indigenizing. Namely, not just thinking about indigenous peoples here, but who we come from and the lands that we come from. Because there is something in the scriptures that talks about how the land and our connection to the land of our peoples can be healing for us. And so it goes beyond just 23andMe ethnicity work, but thinking about the lands that we come from and how we might connect to them even from afar. I think is it a mysterious and profound healing invitation that we have to indigenize ourselves. But after the story of Adam and Eve, we find ourselves outside of Eden, outside of this Edenic, perfect, sacred space, and we meet Cain and Abel. They are two brothers who have split the vocation of Eden. Cain, the firstborn, being a farmer and a steward of the land, and Abel, a shepherd. And I want to point out, and you're just going to come with me for a minute because I guess you kind of have to, a few small etymological things before we continue, namely how things get their names and what those things mean. Because the Hebrew language in this text is doing a lot to make sense of these stories that can often feel like riddles and puzzles. Cain's name has its roots in the Hebrew word kana, and it means to obtain, to attain, or to acquire. It's the same word that's used to describe Eve acquiring both the fruit of the forbidden tree and the knowledge of good and evil itself in the previous story. The parallelism is lost in the English, but invites us to hold attention in the passage. Adam and Eve chose not to trust the generosity and timing of God and acquired, kanad, the knowledge of good and evil themselves on its own terms. They kanad the knowledge. There is something in this story that is inherently about acquiring and taking. But in this story of the next generation, the verb is the same, but what is attained, kanad, is different. Cain is not seeking to attain or kana knowledge, but affirmation and acceptance from God. The irony present in the story from the start is that when one acquires or attains, it's always coming from someone or something else. You cannot attain something just out of nowhere. It comes from somewhere else. And Cain, as a farmer, cannot bring an offering to God without first partnering with God, who makes everything that Cain works on grow and bear fruit. Everything he has and everything he does is already an act of generosity from God and from the land. He cannot make it himself. He can only kana or acquire because God first works and provides. The story tells us that Cain and Abel, if you want to nerd out a little bit, his name means vapor or mist, which is about as long as he is in the story. They both bring an offering to God. The Hebrew is brilliant, y'all. Like, if you want to be like a biblical scholar, just get into it because it's really, really fun. It takes some effort, but it's very, very fun when you get in there. Cain and Abel both bring an offering to God. Cain, the first fruit of his crops, and Abel, the firstborn of his flock. And when they bring the offerings, in the NIV, and I'll critique this in a moment, says this: "The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, God did not look with favor." And I'll be honest, this is not my favorite translation when you get into the text. The "with favor" bit is pretty interpretive and isn't really found in the original text. Because the word here really means to gaze or to look upon. So read that way, it's more accurately, the Lord looked upon Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, the Lord did not look. To me, this framing is really important because it will shape the questions that we ask about God's character. If we read it as God looks with favor at Abel and does not look with favor at Cain, I think we're pretty much allotted two options for what the text might be saying. One, that there is something wrong with Cain's offering. That's how I always heard it interpreted. Like there's something mysterious and terrible that's going on with Cain that cannot be trusted. But it's an offering. The text doesn't give us a sense that it is wrong. Or two, that God's self is withholding God's acceptance, generosity, and gaze from Cain altogether. And I wonder if that is what Cain was thinking and experiencing when his younger brother received the first look and acceptance from God. And what if it is just that, the first look, and that God has not simply turned to Cain yet? What if God is just reordering how God gives honor and does so outside of the normal frames privileging the firstborn? What if the God of the Bible is always seeking to upend power structures and make room for all to be honored and known in their belovedness, despite the systems that hold them? And if we remember, these Genesis stories are things that happen in our world. We might find discomfort in the reality that how God blesses and when God blesses matters almost as much, if not more, than what God actually blesses us with. And when that goes awry, some of us, if we're being honest, internally melt the heck down. This story is also asking the central question of Genesis 1-11. What is this God like? And God seems to recognize, which I think requires a gaze or a look upon, that Cain is upset. And he asks, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." And if we read this story again as something deficient about Cain's offering, we might interpret it as evil somehow. But I wonder if instead God is giving Cain a test about his own sense of sacredness. Because it really does seem like Cain is doing a really good thing in bringing an offering. And by God's words, that means that he will be accepted. Cain himself will be, and I would argue is already, from what God is doing in the text, accepted. It just doesn't happen first. God seems to see that Cain is internally struggling and adds a warning to this statement of acceptance. If you do not do what is good, sin is this thing that is crouching. The language is really strange in the Hebrew. It's like sin is like a croucher, like it's waiting outside. But it's this thing that needs to be controlled and engaged and really avoided in many ways. It seems like Cain is having a crisis of sacredness when he doesn't receive when he believes he should. And he has a choice. He can wait and receive the acceptance that God seems to want to give, or he can give into his crisis of sacredness and choose violence that is readily available when he doesn't feel like there is enough. He is being invited to understand, and I don't want us to miss this, that ascribing sacredness and acceptance to one is not retracting sacredness from another. It is the fundamental problem at the center of the all lives matter ideologies and the meltdowns that happen when those who see themselves as the center suddenly aren't proactively ascribed the honor that they see due to them. And I don't want to act like this is far away from us, because I know that for many white folks specifically, being a part of a church like Quest allows you to critique people who might fall into that camp, but you still may seek to be affirmed or centered first in your activism, your growth, your need to be heard, or your impulse to have your input taken first. This is a Genesis 4 question of sacredness. So Cain invites Abel into the field, the place where he has acquired from God, the land he has a relationship with, this place that shapes his identity, this sacred place. And he kills his brother there. And one of my favorite poets, agrarian poet Wendell Berry, says in his poem, How to Be a Poet, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. In this moment, Cain goes to a sacred place, a land, and he desecrates it. In doubting his own sacredness, he extinguishes the sacred life of his brother and defiles the land that he is on. And I'm compelled by the notion that there are no unsacred places, because it poses an invitation, and I would argue a necessity, to pay attention to the histories of the places that we live, frequent, and visit. Because where there is desecration, there must be healing. And where there is sacredness, there must be awe and wonder and connection. The text points to the reality that the ground does not receive Cain's act of violence and murder neutrally. It seems aware in some mysterious ways of the moral failings of humans and what they do on the land itself. And then God comes to Cain and asks where his brother is, which is also this echo of the Eden conversations that God has when God talks to Cain and Abel's parents, Adam and Eve, asking, where are you in the garden? And Cain lies. And he says he doesn't know. And then he asks this sarcastic but profound question, am I my brother's keeper? And in that question lies the disconnect. Cain seems to have lost the sacredness of the story too. He has lost that to be fully human is not simply to be connected to God, God's self. That is not the fullness of life, but it is caught up in his relationship with other humans and the Creator and the land that he lives and works on. Sacredness is not just an affirmation or the affirmation of the divine. It is the life that comes from seeing all things as Creator sees them and choosing proactively, maybe against all of our impulses, connectedness. So I think that the answer to Cain's question, sarcastic as it is yes. We are each other's keepers, just as he is a keeper of the land. It is the work of sacredness to behold, protect, and fight everything in us that would keep us from actively regarding everything as sacred. And it's part of why I believe that the church has to work really hard, that I have to work really hard to be empathetic and a listening people before we are a missional one. To be connected to story is to take opportunities to remember sacredness and connectedness, and it is an antidote, in my view, to disappearing people, normalizing the violence that happens to our bodies and ignoring the ways that none are free until all are free. But next, God responds to Cain. What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out from the ground. You are now under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. And Cain says to the Lord, and I think it's so tragic, my punishment is more than I can bear. God tells Cain that his moral behavior, his loss of the sacredness of the story, his choice to succumb to violence and the sin that is crouching like an animal and available to him, has apparently irreparably impacted his relationship with the land that he is on. Just like his parents, who also seem to doubt the goodness, timing, and generosity of God, Cain's distancing from sacredness desecrates not only the land itself, but his relationship with it. It is a desecration of the connection and the thing itself. And I'm compelled by what God seems to say has happened to Cain. The land has opened its mouth to receive Abel's blood, his life. And in turn, the land refuses to produce for Cain. And Abel's blood cries out from the ground. The land itself is a witness to human moral failure, to violence, and to bloodshed. And it's been here a hell of a lot longer than we have been. And it makes me wonder what the earth has seen. There is a wound that seems to happen to the earth when violence occurs. And it gives me pause because it's not the only time in the biblical story where a moral failure leading to violence changes people's relationship to the earth and impacts the earth itself. It's everywhere in the text as we look at Israel's relationship with the land. That often results at various points in the land not cooperating, yielding, and even causing it to do things like reject the people, or some of the text says like spit them out. So not only does humanity's relationship with the earth reflect on the measure of the quality and fullness of the human life and experience, but on the health of the earth itself. What was home, provider, parent, co-laborer becomes desecrated, uninhabitable, and feels like it is, if it's not actually driving people from it. So as I look at climate change, I can see the ways that the earth seems to be responding to what we do, our human moral failure, our violence, our extraction, our taking. There's a reason Christians have to care about this, because it is a part of the sacredness of our story. And I think it means that we have to pay more attention. Because the earth, if it is a witness, will teach us something about what we are, who we are, how we are to each other, in how it responds to us. And Cain in the story is devastated when he learns what his actions have caused. He seems to understand that separation from the land for any reason is a great, great loss. Some of us have never really experienced this connection with the land to begin with, but I think that we can and really should try. Because if we do not know connection, there's a good chance that we will miss it or be uncaring when brokenness and disconnection or desecration occurs. We cannot know disconnection without knowing connection first. Namely, connecting to the earth more deeply ourselves will help us know how to pursue sacredness and build our awareness where there is desecration and a need for connection and healing. And it makes me think about some of the projects of the Equal Justice Initiative, who goes to sites of lynchings and gathers soil to create a sober memorial of the devastation of racial violence in the United States. But they also have a project that I think is just as, if not more compelling, called the Historical Markers Project, where they go set up historical markers at the sites of lynchings in order to expose and tell the truth about what happened in those specific places. And when these historical markers are placed, they often have a ceremony to tell the story of the violence and to acknowledge not just the person, but the land that this violent act happened on. They're telling the truth. And a friend of mine recalled to me what it felt like to be at one of those gatherings, telling me about how they lit candles as they gathered. They told the story. And from the place of the ceremony to the actual location where the lynching happened, they spread thousands and thousands and thousands of rose petals to leave on the land like an offering. And something about that struck me, and I think strikes me again now, that where there is violence, there must be repair. Where there is trauma, there must be acknowledgement, remembrance, and restoration. Why would it be different with the land that has seen and experienced more violence than we can articulate or know? So while I don't know if thousands of rose petals create holistic healing for the land, for the traumas it's experienced, I know that it does something to reclaim a place from desecration and move it toward or in the direction of sacredness again. And that matters. It matters even if we don't know what these acts of healing and acknowledgement do cosmically, because I think it's just more than that. It does something to acknowledge the land and what it is experienced. It does something to us to build connection to its sacredness. It helps us to honor what the earth has seen and witnessed and to do our part as we reflect on the earth to prevent the violence that has happened from what is usually human insecurity and nonsense. Because how we act violently has an impact, not just on people, but on the land itself. The scriptures attest to that. So after Cain hears the consequences of his actions, the text continues in such a sad way. I've spent so much time just kind of crying as I've read this text this week. It becomes clear all along that Cain has wanted to be near to and seen by God. And he now believes that God is actually going to abandon him, not simply not look upon him. The text tells us what Cain says back to God. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. Remember, he wants a look from God, and now he feels like he's going to be forever hidden. But the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This is what God is like. The God that offered grace to Abel in subverting familial systems to bless him first offers an unreasonably extra measure of grace to Cain, who by all estimation from Torah deserves death. God, as God was with Adam and Eve, offers more to Cain than he expects, deserves, and that might even be just. This God in Genesis 1-11 is generous, presenting and modeling a belief and commitment to the sacredness of all things and people, even and maybe particularly when they or when we do not deserve it. God does it even when violence takes over and seeks to make us rob each other of our sacredness in order to feel more sacred ourselves, because that is what violence is, right? It's a loss of our own sacredness and an acting out of that lack of sacredness or a loss of the sacredness of others or the earth to the point where we take and extract, kill, disregard. It is giving in to the sin that stands like a croucher at our door, that's always ready to capitalize on our jealousy, our taking, our need to be better than we are, our need to seem fancier or better than we are. And so I actually have really simple invitations today. I want us to be a people, I'll say simple, but not easy. I want to be people who fundamentally commit to dismantling violence in us, which in this case might mean unlearning and paying attention to jealousy, insecurity, and believing that receiving love and acceptance from God or from others is a zero-sum game. Life is not a competition of sacredness. It is an acknowledgement and an enjoyment of it. Part of leaning away from violence is leaning more into security in who we are and how we are with others. Because the impulse of violence of all kinds, emotional, sexual, physical, spiritual, manipulative, often comes when we either denigrate our own sacredness, because I think for some of us the work of unlearning violence is unlearning violence toward ourselves first. That often comes from rampant self-criticism. I think there's a gentle invitation for many of us to unlearn violence in ourselves first, to unlearn hatred in ourselves first, to make space for ourselves to be gentle and soft. I think it's part of how we reconnect with the community of creation. It is fundamentally an invitation towards softness, gentleness, sensitivity, and self-reflection. There's a reason that in movies like, I'll just expose my nerdiness, like the Lord of the Rings, when there are these scenes with like millions and millions of people or thousands and thousands of people being just butchered on screen, there's a reason that the stories don't tell us like a 5-minute vignette of those people's lives first. There's a reason I don't see the orc over here falling in love and having a kid and enjoying things and laughing and being part of a story. Because if I were to expose the violence after seeing that story, it might shape me differently. So I want us to become more sensitive to the goodness and sacredness of all things that hold story in a specific way. And I think a particular way that we can do that as Quest is to become people who are not desensitized under any circumstances to the gun violence epidemic in the US. The more I see, the less I seem to care. We've had a mass shooting every day this year. Like kids, like young kids both killing and being killed every day. And I think our impulse is to see so much violence that we no longer take it seriously, and we have to resist that quest. We have to. Because the moment that we become complacent is when our practical and political action ends, and when our witness for whatever that's worth, is completely useless. We cannot be a people who are not sensitive to violence. And I believe that the land, who again has seen more than we ever will, experienced more than we can imagine, has healed and grown and persisted and adjusted, can teach us so much. And so my invitation today is toward a more contemplative, compassionate, and connective relationship with the land that affirms its sacredness, because we know that if we have a more sacred relationship with the land, it will likely mean we have the same with each other in our own bodies in the world we're in. So I want us to pay attention, to slow down, to go sit by a tree and listen, to learn the histories of the lands that we're on and the lands that we came from, to pay attention to the intricacies of what we see around us and to learn marvel, to take back a posture of sacredness that the world will consistently try to strip from us. I think our own sense of sacredness of others and of the land counts on it. And we don't do this just because it's right, but I think it is. But because it's an act of worship, to become like the God of this story, the God who sees everything and is so committed to everything being sacred, that God will go to great lengths, even against God's own standards, to make sure that we know how loved, valuable, good, and worthy of redemption the whole creation is. How good, worthy, valuable, and worthy of redemption you are and your neighbor is. Like, I just want to see the world that way. And I don't really know how all the time, but I think that the earth can be our teacher. So if there's one practice you take this week as you build your relationship with the earth, I want to invite you to pay attention and to be curious. Because if judgment and curiosity are poles on spectrum ends with one another, with one leading to desecration and violence, paying attention and being curious might just help us to slow down, reorient ourselves, and create more space in our own being to undo violence and find the sacredness that we want and need to experience. It's my hope for us, Quest. So let's pray to that end. God, you already see us as sacred. You know and love us in all of our nonsense, just like you did for Cain. And you invite us not away from ourselves, but more into ourselves and our own sacredness and connection to you and to all things around us. And so I pray that you would do a mysterious work, God, of helping us to fall in love with the creation and the land that you've created, especially for those of us who have had antagonistic or maybe just non-existent relationships with the earth. I pray actually, Jesus, for silliness, that we would see little flowers on the ground or tiny little mushrooms that are shaped like something, and we would giggle and laugh and connect and restore. That as we're on the earth acknowledging and participating, that what we would find is connectedness, sacredness, softness, sensitivity, and worth that we haven't found in any other way. Soften us, Jesus. We need you to help us. Amen.